Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Leah. I'm the Director of Knowledge Exchange at Women's Shelters Canada. I'm very excited for this webinar. This is part 2 of a 3-part series. So it's going to be a continuation of a webinar from a few weeks ago, which we'll say a bit more about in a few minutes here. But what I want to start with is just acknowledging that I am joining you today from the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And as a settler, I acknowledge my responsibility to continue to learn about settler colonialism and to continue to support the work of reconciliation and decolonization. And so that's me. It would be great to know who else is here. So if you do want to just pop in the chat there, say hello, let us know who you are, where you're joining from. We'd love to get to know who's in the room. And before we get going into our content here, I'm just going to do a few housekeeping reminders. I've already mentioned, as you heard, that we do have interpretation going today. So if you head down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a globe marked interpretation. You can click on that. You can choose English or French according to the language you want to hear. And I will put those instructions into the chat in just a minute as well. And if you do have any tech issues or anything like that today, just let me know in the chat and I will do my best to get that sorted out for you. So, on that note, you've probably noticed you can't turn on your mic, you can't turn on your video. So for today, only the presenters are going to have their video and mic on. We just want to make sure the audio quality is great for the interpreters and everyone else. But we do want you to participate. So you can participate in the chat box, as many of you are already doing. That's a great place to say hi, to put any comments. I'm going to be sharing some resources in there as we go through. If you have a question for the presenters, I encourage you to put that in the Q&A box, which is right beside your chat. That way, it's just a little bit easier for me to keep track of all of those questions and make sure that we get to everything. If it's in the chat, it can get a bit lost. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A at any point during the presentations, and we'll get to those as we go through, and then comments, hellos in the chat. We are recording today's webinar, and the recording is going to be available on our website within a few weeks, and we will share the recording as well with everyone who has registered. And in a few minutes, I'll share the link for the recording of the previous webinar too, for anyone who missed that. Now, so as I said, today is part 2 of a 3-part series that's aimed at giving shelters and transition houses an overview of the development process. So, the last one, the first one, we covered feasibility. Today, we're focused on the design and development phases. Like I said, I'm going to put the recording from last week into the chat, or sorry, 2 weeks ago. If you missed it, you'll be able to kind of catch up there. But yeah, we're gonna move forward into design and development. And our presenters are the same for this session as last time. So we have Kyla Tanner, who is the Development Project Manager for Women's Shelters Canada, and Megan Golfetto, who is Project Coordinator for the same project here at Women's Shelters Canada. And we also have Amanda Owens, the Executive Director of Ksan Society in BC. So we're very excited to hear from all 3 of you today and get a bit more information about this phase of development of development. And I will mention as well, because this was a question that came in a lot last time, I am going to share the PowerPoint presentations in the chat in English and French as soon as Megan and Kyla get started, and we will share those by email afterwards as well. So you will get those. So before getting into the presentations, I'm going to launch a little poll. Oops, there we go. So that should pop up on your screen now. This is just a chance for us to get to know who's here, who's in the room, and where are you at? What are you thinking about related to this topic? So the first question is just asking where you're joining from. And then the second question, we want to get a sense of, when you think about embarking on a development project, what is your most pressing concern? You don't know how to get started, finding pre-construction funding, hiring key team members, coordinating a design team, finding total project funding, construction challenges, or you have no concerns. So I'll give folks a few seconds to put their answers in. There's a couple more people responding, so I'll just give it another few seconds. Great. Okay, I'm going to close that and share that back for everyone. So we have great representation here. We've got BC, we've got the prairies in the house, lots of folks from Ontario, we've got Quebec, Atlantic provinces. So we really have quite cross-country representation here. In terms of what you're thinking about or what you're concerned about, project funding is the biggest one here at 54%. Not knowing how to get started is another big concern here. So that's great. I think you're in the right place with this webinar series. Finding pre-construction funding and construction challenges also on the board there. So I'm going to take that down, and without further ado, I will pass it over to Kyla and Megan.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. Let me just get my screen all set up. Okay, great. Hi everyone. Welcome to the second session in the Introduction to the Development Process webinar series. As Leah said, my name is Megan, and I'm the project coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada. I'm joined by Kyla, our development project manager, and Amanda Owens, the executive director at Ksan Society. We're all looking forward to sharing with you today during this presentation. So to start, Kyla and I will introduce ourselves. Amanda will provide her introduction later in the presentation. I've been working in the violence against women shelter sector since 2019 with experience as a frontline worker and also as a fundraising and communications professional. From my direct work with women and children fleeing violence, I've seen families struggle to find housing that meets their needs, as I'm sure many of you here today have witnessed. I've also seen the essential life-saving services that shelters and transition houses provide, many of whom do not have adequate operational funding to keep their doors open, let alone time and funds to explore building more housing. These are some of the reasons why I'm especially passionate about the creation of more affordable spaces for women and children fleeing violence.
Hey, hi everyone. So I began working in the affordable housing development world for nonprofits and charities in 2019. And over the last 4 years, I've assisted many organizations through the entire development process as a project manager. So helping with the feasibility study and starting out a project, applying for funding, which sounds like a lot of people are concerned about today, navigating design development, which we're going to get into, as well as construction phases, which we'll talk about next webinar. But my passion for the right to safe and adequate housing for women and children led me to join the VAW sector in 2022 at Women's Shelters Canada.
Great. Thanks so much, Kyla. So why are we doing a three-part webinar series on the development process? We realized that many executive directors find the development world unfamiliar and intimidating. You don't know what you don't know, and embarking on a new project can be overwhelming and stressful. Trying to juggle this alongside your regular responsibilities is quite a task. You're essentially doing another job off the side of the desk, off the side of your current job's desk that you don't have previous experience in. So, in response, we created this three-part webinar series to help demystify the development process and offer you a clear understanding of what it takes to build a new facility. We want to make the process less daunting, or at the very least, help you to identify which aspects might be challenging and how you can seek support. Over these three sessions, we'll go over the basics of the development process. We'll identify the key steps to building a new building, and we'll address questions such as who to hire for your team, when to bring them on board, and the roles and responsibilities that everyone has throughout the process. We understand that the development landscape can be confusing, time consuming, and likely an area where you have limited exposure. So by the end of the series, we hope that you'll feel more confident about your role and the next steps for your project. So today's session is the second part. We're going to discuss the design and development phase of the process. The third and final session will be on June 13th, and it will focus on the last two phases, construction and operations. Just a note that this series is a high-level overview, so each phase that we touch upon could easily be its own three-part webinar series. However, today's objective is just to provide you with a general overview so you can start your learning journey. So we'll do a very quick recap of what we covered in the first webinar, feasibility, and then we're going to dive into design and development. We'll pause for questions twice during the presentation, and then we're going to turn things over to Amanda to share her experience with the design and development phase of Ksan Society's projects. She'll be providing a really valuable perspective as a VAW shelter and can answer any questions that you might have. Okay, so we're going to get started with our first recap. So phase one, feasibility, is a time-intensive process, and it will likely take you several years. You'll want to designate a single person as a champion to lead and advocate for the project. This is generally the executive director of the organization. Also, make sure that you're dedicating staff time for the feasibility process so that they can provide you with feedback necessary to the project. You'll also want to consider hiring a project manager. They can help facilitate the development process and leverage their expertise and allow the executive director to focus on their primary role of running their existing shelter organization. You also may need to hire others to your team, like an architect, to do some early concept design. You'll also need to ensure that the project is financially viable before you can move on to the next phase, design development. This is the reason for the first takeaway. It could take several years before you create something viable. And finally, the work conducted in this phase can be nicely compiled into a business case or a feasibility study. And this is really helpful for applying for any pre-construction or pre-development funding. Okay, so let's say that you have a feasible project. What happens next? So in phase two, our focus shifts to creating a feasible design for the project and securing the necessary resources to build and operate. This slide gives you a comprehensive overview of the phase and what to expect. So, like I said, the purpose is to develop a feasible design for the project, secure your funding for construction and operation, and obtain any necessary approvals from your municipality or your local government. The key activities or the components are to hire your consultants and trades, acquire the site, conduct any site studies, design the building, refine the pro forma, finalizing the capital and the operational budgets, securing financial sources to fund the project, continuing to engage with the community, which you've been doing in feasibility, which you will continue to do in construction and operations, and you're going to go through the planning approvals process. We'll go over each of these activities today in more detail during the presentation. And at the end of the phase, you will have beautiful designs of your building. You're going to have land, either by purchasing it or having it gifted to you for free. All of your site studies will be complete. You'll also have commitments from funders, ideally signed funding agreements. So if the building costs $5 million, you're going to know exactly how you're paying for that $5 million. You'll also have a site plan agreement or equivalent in your jurisdiction. You'll have a signed construction contract with the builder, and you'll have obtained a building permit. This is a big phase. A lot gets done in this time period. So navigating through this phase involves many large tasks. So the timeline is going to be influenced by the amount of time and resources that you can dedicate to it. So some people might be able to get through the design and development phase in 6 months. This generally would mean that your project should be fairly modest in size, and you would be spending a lot of time on this project if you got it done in 6 months. Something that's more realistic might be about a year. Some projects will take longer, especially if they have municipal approval processes to get through or you're waiting on funding agreements. Some projects will pause in this phase as well. If there's no funding to move ahead into construction, you are going to have to wait. Okay, so assembling a dedicated and skilled core team is crucial for your success. We discussed some of these core team member roles in the first webinar, and I'll just give you a quick recap and introduce a new one. So there's the project owner, that's you or the shelter director. You're going to maintain the vision and oversee the project, and you're going to make sure that your project aligns with your organization's overall goals. Then there's the project manager, also known as the development consultant. Hopefully you've hired them in the feasibility phase. They're going to facilitate the overall project process, They can assist you in hiring team members. They'll conduct your preliminary pro forma or financial modeling, and they're going to explore potential sites and funding options for your project. The architect's role is to develop a feasible design for the project. So at this stage, the architect will likely engage sub engineers, mechanical, electrical, structural, civil, and potentially a landscape architect to help with the designs. And then there's also the construction manager slash general contractor slash builder. They can be called different things depending on the type of contract that you have with them. And the contract will also determine when you hire them. For example, if you hire them early, they're called a construction manager. If they're just coming in to build, you may say a general contractor or a builder. In our experience, it is best to hire them early as your construction manager. They can provide extremely valuable insight at the outset of design development from their experience working on other construction projects. Doesn't usually cost much either to include them early in the process. For the sake of the webinar series, we're going to refer to them as the builder. And they essentially go oversee the entire construction process and they execute the finalized design and bring your building to life. Beyond the core team of the project owner, the project manager, the architect, and the builder, you may need some of these other consultants indicated on the slide for some specialized support. A planner would be needed if you live in an urban area. They can help you navigate zoning bylaws and planning approvals in your municipality. If you're in a rural area, you likely won't need a planner. You'll almost certainly need a lawyer. They can assist you in site purchase negotiations, review funding agreements, and provide general legal guidance throughout the process if needed. Hiring a realtor could also be useful if you need help finding a site. An organization that we worked with used a realtor to help them find their perfect site close to their existing facilities. The site wasn't actually publicly listed for sale, so using the realtor's knowledge and expertise really paid off in that situation. An appraiser might also be needed to determine how much your site is worth. This is especially useful for funding applications to identify your land equity. If a land survey hasn't been done recently, you'll also need a land surveyor. They'll ensure that the property surveys are updated and address any boundary or property line concerns. Environmental engineers also may be needed at some point to conduct environmental site assessments and geotechnical studies on the land. These reports are needed for almost all capital funding applications, and I'll get into that a little bit later. A quantity surveyor will be used to provide you with detailed estimates of how much your building will cost. So once you've secured your capital funding, you'll also need a quantity surveyor for CMHC funding releases, which we'll talk more about in the next webinar on construction and operations. If you're in an urban area, you'll likely need to hire a transportation study consultant and a noise study consultant. The transportation consultant can assess the accessibility and transportation requirements of your site, and the noise study consultant evaluates the noise levels of the area around your site. An energy consultant can conduct an energy model based on your designs and make any suggestions to improve its energy efficiency. And finally, you may want to hire a commissioning agent if you're building more than 20 units, because projects of this size and larger tend to have more complicated HVAC systems. The commissioning agent will act as a third party to provide an external review of the mechanical and electrical systems, just to make sure that everything is in working order. While these consultants do contribute to an increase in your soft costs, their experience is invaluable in creating a well-rounded and high-functioning shelter facility. So now that we know who to hire, we're going to discuss the process to hire all of these consultants, and we're going to start with hiring your core team. So, as a reminder, your core team members are the architect, the builder, and the project manager if you have one. If you do have a project manager, they can help you with hiring. Your core team members are very important to the project, so you'll want to take hiring them very seriously. The first step in this process is to prepare a request for proposals or an RFP document. The document's going to outline the expected scope of work of the consultant. The next step is to establish your evaluation criteria or define the qualities and experience that you're looking for in your consultants. An example of this criteria could be that the consultant has had previous experience working with other violence against women shelters. Once you have an idea of what you're looking for, you can identify some potential firms to send the RFP to. Your project manager will know who you can send that to, but you can also ask for recommendations from other shelters in your area that have done a development project. Then you'll send out the RFPs with a deadline to receive the proposals. You could also request that the firms send you references from past clients. Ideally, the firm has worked with an affordable housing provider in the past or has experience with projects funded by CMHC. Then you'll receive and review the submissions, prepare a short list for interviews, and then conduct those interviews. In the end, you're going to select your preferred bidder and enter into an official contract with them. When choosing your team members, we highly encourage you to choose people that align with your organization and project values. There will be bumps along the way, and you'll want team members that really believe in your project and can help you navigate these challenges. Unfortunately, we've seen shelters with architects that have over designed their project building. The architect was focused on building something beautiful and out of the box to add to their architectural portfolio, and they weren't really concerned with creating a building that actually met the shelter's needs. We've also seen projects extremely delayed in construction because their builder started working on a bigger, more expensive project. So, the key takeaway from this slide is to spend time finding and hiring an experienced, trustworthy team that aligns with your organizational values. So, when hiring additional consultants like the planner, lawyer, environmental engineer, etc., you'll want to follow a more streamlined process. There isn't a need to repeat the hiring process that I just explained for every single consultant because the consultants outside of the core team members generally have a much smaller scope of work. However, you will need to consider your organization's procurement policy. We've seen shelters with policies that require at least 3 bids for every hired consultant. This can be quite a time consuming process, especially if you have to hire every consultant that I listed earlier in the presentation. If this is the case for your organization, we do recommend amending this policy to add a financial spending threshold. For example, 3 bids are required if the scope of work exceeds $5,000 or $10,000. This can be a helpful amendment to keep your project moving and minimize any delays. When hiring other consultants outside of your core team members, you'll want to clearly outline the scope of work and define the expected timeline for the completion of work. Once these are defined, then you'll want to identify potential firms. Your architect or your builder may actually have some recommendations for these consultants, which you could consider. You'll then request a fee for service or quotes for both the work being done and the timeline. And once you receive the submissions, you'll select the consultant based on their cost, timeline, and qualifications. When selecting your consultant, you will be tempted to choose the lowest bidder. We encourage you to consider all 3 factors of cost, time, and qualifications when making your decision. The lowest bidder will be the cheapest, but they also could take twice as long to get the work done. This could cause your schedule to slip, which could cost you more than the difference between the low bid and the high bid. You'll also be acquiring the site in the design and development phase if you haven't already. This is when you're going to have your lawyer assist with the land purchase or the lease agreement. Acquiring the site is crucial for eligibility in many funding programs. Even if having a site isn't required to apply to a funding program, your application will look much more competitive if you already have land. Having a site is essential for progressing with any planning approvals. As well, design drawings involve substantial time, money, and effort. You don't want to spend a lot of time and money on creating drawings for a site that you don't own because it could be a waste if you're never able to purchase that site. That being said, there is a balance here. In the feasibility webinar, we recommended assessing potential sites to see if that piece of land could fit your project idea. This would involve doing some initial concept designs. However, you don't want to progress the designs too far in case you aren't able to acquire that site, so we encourage you to keep that in mind. Okay, and when considering a site, or once you've acquired a site, you'll need to conduct some site studies, which will help inform your project's design and ensure compliance with regulatory standards. So if you're building a new building, it will require a phase 1 environmental site assessment or an ESA. This will identify any potential concerns for contamination on your site. Depending on findings from ESA 1, a phase 2 ESA might be needed. Um, the phase 2 ESA would confirm any contamination that you have and then would require you to clean it up before moving forward. A geotechnical report will also be needed, which is a soil study. The study could tell you that the soil is soft and needs engineered fill to support your building, as an example. Or it could maybe tell you that the soil is on top of a rock that will need to be broken down to put in the foundation. A retrofit project will need a designated substances survey to determine what is in the building, such as asbestos. And it will also require a building condition assessment, which is a report that evaluates existing structures. The report can tell you the state of the building, what will need updating, and what you can keep. Additional studies may also be needed depending on your location. As mentioned previously, a noise study, a transportation study, a topographical survey, or a tree conservation report is likely needed for urban areas. So we encourage you to seek municipal guidance early to determine exactly what studies are needed for your site. And you can ask for a meeting with a city planner, and they should provide you with a list of what is required. Okay, so we're about halfway through the content. So I just want to pause here for any questions about the material so far.
Amazing. Thank you, Megan. So I just a reminder to folks, you can put your questions in the Q&A box. While people do that, we do actually have two questions that folks submitted after the previous webinar. So I'm going to put those to you while the other questions are coming in. So the first question was, do you have a template for a request for proposal for a project manager or an architect that you could share? And the second question was, how could folks access the one-on-one meetings with you, Megan and Kyla, that you mentioned in the previous webinar?
Great, thanks, Leah. So for the request for proposals template for project managers or architects, Kyla and I are actually working on one right now that we're hoping to put up on our website under the resources section shortly. But if you need it, please send us an email and we'd be happy to share it with you. Kyla's going to put her email address in the chat if you're looking for that template. And the answer to the second question about how to book a one-on-one meeting, again, is to email Kyla. So the email that she's going to put in the chat there, just reach out and we'll book a time to discuss your project and your next steps for that too, and address any questions that you have.
Awesome, thanks. So I don't see any other questions coming in at this point. So I think why don't you continue with the presentation, and we are going to pause again for questions. So just a reminder to folks to put those in the Q&A at any time.
Awesome. Okay, so diving into this next section, we're going to focus heavily on design drawings as well as the money side of things. And gathering from the poll at the beginning, people want to hear about money, so that's great. As you can gather from the title of this phase, designing the building is a really large task that's going to take place. So the design of the building happens in stages, and we call these design drawings. Your architect and their subconsultants, the mechanical and electrical engineers, structural, civil, we call them the design team, and they're all working on designing your building. That's their major task. They're going to each create their own set of design drawings. So you're actually going to have all of these different sets. You're going to have a mechanical set, electrical set, structural, civil, and architectural. The architectural one is probably the one that you're going to look at the most, or at least be the most familiar with. If it's a more modest or simple building, just a note that you might not have structural. It just might not be necessary. But if you're kind of doing multi-levels, then that would come into place. And then there's a step-by-step evolution of the design drawings. So if you think about like an important document that you're working on, or maybe you're working on a presentation that you're about to give, you're probably going to have multiple drafts. The first draft is going to be really rough. It's probably just like an outline of your notes. And then it becomes more and more polished and detailed the more time you spend on it. Your design drawings are the exact same. We just actually have titles for all of those drafts. So the first one is called the concept drawing. We showed an example of it in the first webinar, but essentially it's just like the outline of the basic building structure, right? So you're looking at it like an aerial view and it's just kind of a block. That's probably happening in feasibility. So you've likely already finished that. And that's just going to be the architectural set. There is no mechanical or electrical yet. So that's most simplistic version. The next one that comes into play is the schematic drawing, and there's an example of this on the right here on this slide. This is when you start to see rooms and hallways outlined. Again, it's still fairly basic, but at least you're starting to see kind of like the shape of the building take place. And next one is permit drawings. This is when you're starting to get more detailed. These drawings end up getting submitted to the regulatory bodies for permit approvals. They're going to reflect compliance with building code and regulations, that sort of thing. And then your tender drawings are when you're getting that ready to start construction. Trades will end up looking at these drawings and they include much finer details. And the very final set is your construction drawings. That's the most detailed. They're going to specify dimensions, materials, placing of all of the elements, everything that the people need to know how to build your building. Some architectural firms will use different terminology. They might say something like 33%, 66%, and 99% drawings. These still align with the outline that we've kind of put here. It's essentially a progression of drawings that just gets more and more detailed. And we're going to talk about money in a second, but we just want to note here that as the drawings become more detailed, they're used for the exercise of what we call costing. So at the outset, when you have your concept drawings, it's really hard to know what your building's actually going to cost, right? Like all you've got is a little rectangle drawn onto a map. That's why in the last webinar, we talked about the architectural program. So it's figuring out approximately how much of the area size of your building is. So how many feet squared. And then we use that to figure out the very first cost. So that's the very first estimate of what your building might end up being. So is it 5 million, 10 million, $20 million? But from here, once you're going through schematic, permit, tender, and construction, you're actually having your costing get more detailed as well. So the drawings get more detailed, and then either your construction manager, if you've hired somebody early, or you might hire a quantity surveyor, like Megan mentioned, they're going to do what they call costing of the building. So they're going to estimate how much they think the building will cost based on the level of detail of drawings that are created by your design team. A good question that you're probably wanting to ask at this moment is like, well, how does my design team know what to put in as they get further and further detailed? Some of this is based on building code. So it's just going to be specified with what like size of hallways you have to have and how many stairwells and windows in that room. But a lot of it is actually going to come from you as their client. So when Megan and I were stressing in the feasibility study that you want to set up a really clear vision, that's going to help guide the drawings. You are going to need to provide additional feedback. That can't be the only thing. You just give them like one piece of paper at the outset and they're going to go away and design the building for a year. So instead, they're actually going to guide, the architect will lead these bi-weekly team meetings, and that will happen throughout the entire design and development phase. They're probably going to ask more questions of you and get a clarification of things to inform the designs. So you'll be at those meetings, as well as your project manager once you have them on board, and your construction manager if you've hired them, or your builder. You would all be there, and a lot of it I find actually ends up being kind of brainstorming solutions to any problems that arise and kind of workshopping things together, which can be really fun. The engineers could join for the odd meeting just to address kind of technical aspects that might come up, but otherwise they're having their own bi-weekly meetings, probably on offset weeks, just with the architect. So they're having their own meetings that are a bit separate. You don't often see the engineers. So while these designs are progressing, it's really important that you're giving good feedback because the drawings are getting more detailed. And on the right here, we've got a snapshot of a much more detailed drawing of just one unit. You might not actually know how to read and understand it, right? Like even once you have a more trained eye, it does take a while to kind of sift through those drawings and really see what's in front of you. I'd highly recommend asking your architect for a separate meeting on your own just to do a walkthrough with you. Your project manager can do this too if the architect doesn't have time, or maybe you've got a really good relationship with your project manager and they're just going to sit for 3 hours while you guys go through each room in the building. But what you want to do is involve some key staff members to give feedback on these designs. You definitely want to do this early. So in schematic, as well as the permit drawings, or that 33% and 66% around there. And we encourage you to involve two different types of staff. The first is somebody who's going to be running your programming. So they're going to know when a room needs multiple doors or which offices should be close together, if community rooms should be near a certain office, are the bedrooms large enough? All of these kinds of things. You want that input from them, but also the person who's going to be responsible for your mechanical and electrical systems, like your HVAC, heat pumps, water heaters. I remember being in a meeting with that whole design team, and they were proposing a certain type of HVAC system, and the person responsible for that system, once it was up and running, was there. And they're like, oh, I've used that system on a building before and I hated it. Like, please choose any other system but that one. It was a really easy change to make. We talked about it super early, and I thought that it was so valuable to have that person in the room, because I think my nightmare is that you spend $3 million, $5 million, $10 million on your building, and your staff walk into it the first day and they're like, oh, why did I put that there? Like, what a strange decision to have made. And it's just because you didn't ask them, right? So get their feedback early. If you wait until later, so if you're at kind of like the tender or 99%, and then somebody's looking at it and they're like, oh, like, I think you should move that wall, you might not actually be able to. It could just be too late in the process. And it sounds simple, like when you're looking at the drawing, you're just like, oh, just make that closet bigger. Like, it seems so simple. Well, maybe closet's a bad example, but like certain walls might have electrical in them. They could affect the plumbing next to it. It might be a structural wall. And therefore, you're not only changing your architectural set, but your mechanical, and you're involving all of those engineers. And anytime that you think that those people are doing work, it means that it's costing you money. And so if it's not, if it's a change that's being made late and they're having to go back and make those changes, it's going to cost you a lot of money, and it could end up actually delaying your construction start too. So get the feedback early. We're saying before this presentation that, like, if you don't remember anything else, we really want you to remember this one piece of info, is to involve your key staff members in some of the early design reviews. Your architect's going to make sure that it meets code. So you don't need to worry about that. That doesn't have to be on your radar. That's their job. That's why they're hired. But what you are going to need to let them know is if you have any like accessibility or energy efficiency requirements. So you might be applying for funding that needs a certain number of accessible units, or there's a target of energy efficiency that they have to meet. Definitely let them know that, again, as soon as possible, because they're going to change the designs based on it, especially your mechanical and electrical systems. You're also going to be balancing design aspirations with budget constraints. So as an example, it'd probably be really nice to have a balcony on every unit that you're thinking of doing. Balconies are pretty expensive. So maybe the balance there is that you're not putting a balcony on every unit, but you actually have a balcony per floor. And then women that are wanting to just get some fresh air or maybe take a smoke break, that they can just go, down the hall, stay in their pajamas, and they're not having to exit the building, which would be quite nice. So you do want to make sure that any design changes that are happening, though, like when the architect is asking you questions in those biweekly meetings, make sure that your answers also come with like what cost implication does that have? So let's use the balcony example. Your architect says, hey, do you want a balcony on every unit? And you're like, yes, of course I do. That sounds so nice. But your follow-up should actually be, well, what will it cost me? Like, what is the cost for a balcony on every unit versus a balcony per floor versus no balconies, right? And that could be the difference of actually several $100,000. And if you're out there fundraising all of this money, maybe not everybody has a balcony. So try and seek a balance there. You don't want to cut everything. You do want the important stuff that's still in your building, but just make sure that you're asking what it means, and don't be embarrassed to ask. Like, never feel like, oh, I feel like this is a silly question. There's no such thing. This process is really complex. And like Megan was saying, you've hired people that share your values, and that's really important. So they're there to help you, right? Like, that's why you've hired them. That's why you're paying for them. They want you to understand. They don't want you to be left in the dark. So always lean on your team. Something else that's happening through the design and development phase is that your performa is continuing to be refined. So we talked about the performa in the last webinar, but it's that complex Excel document that tells you how much your project is going to cost. It has your capital budget as well as your operational budget, and your project manager is responsible for your performa. So when I was just talking about those design drawings and then them getting more detailed, that in turn is updating your cost estimates, and the cost estimates are going into your pro forma. So your budget is becoming actually more accurate as you go through this phase two. And there's going to be dozens of iterations of the pro forma and budget. Every time you make a decision, then the drawings change, your costing changes, your budget changes, right? Whether to have balconies or not affects the design, affects the budget. Included in the pro forma is something that we call a contingency. You're probably familiar with the term, like maybe you have contingency plans for your picnic in the park, just in case it rains, right? So as an example. So contingency is an amount of money that you've added to your budget in case something doesn't go to plan, in case it rains. And it will rain. It will rain at some point during this process. Hopefully it's just a drizzle, right? So at the outset, when you just have your conceptual drawing, it's just that box, you want to have a lot of contingency set aside. A healthy amount could be about 15 to almost 25% on top of the estimated cost that you have. This is going to feel like a lot when you're trying to keep your costs down, but it's because your drawings are so basic. There's way too many unknowns to know exactly what the building is going to cost. So it's like thinking that your picnic day is a year away and you don't even know what season it's going to be in yet. So there's a good chance that there's going to be rain. You better have a contingency plan. As your drawings become more and more detailed, though, you can lower your contingency. So by the time you're ready for construction, you might have 5–10% contingency. Never have zero, because there's always a chance of that freak rainstorm, things like supply chain disruptions or your siding contractor going out of business. A shelter that we're working with in construction right now, they're building off the back of their existing shelter. And the foundation for the existing shelter is actually in poorer shape than anticipated and needs to be fixed. So this is an unforeseen cost, and there will be some contingency used. You can check out our our common housing terms and acronyms document that's on our website. There's a definition of contingency and cost estimates in there. So if I'm using a lot of words that kind of feel unfamiliar, we highly recommend you go and just refer back to that document. And if you're kind of going through that phase right now, Megan and I are always happy to chat about it with you further outside of this. Okay, so now we're going to take a few slides to talk about money and how you're going to pay for your project. We're going to think about this in like two different kind of sections though. The first one being pre-construction, and then the second one being construction. So you can think about it as the time before the first shovel goes in the ground, and then, once they're digging up your foundation, everything that happens after that. So let's talk about pre-construction to start. Hopefully you've already secured some of the pre-construction funding. We talked about this in the last webinar. So what we found is that doing this phase two in design development, preparing your project to apply for construction, you're going to be spending money. So you're paying for those site studies that Megan talked about, hiring those consultants she talked about, the design drawings that I just went over, right? You're paying the architect and all of those engineers to do that. It's a lot of work. And what we're seeing from other shelters is that this could cost, on the low end, maybe $100,000, and on the high end, closer to $1 million. I know that's a bit scary. It depends on the context and the size of your building. But know that there should be probably a couple $100,000 that you're going to be spending in this phase, right, during phase two. So how are you going to pay for it? Definitely apply to your local government, your province, other funders like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. You're going to start using FCM as their acronym, or the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, CMHC. A lot of them will have kind of these early pre-construction funding opportunities. We're also seeing that energy companies are offering some of this. So if you're in Ontario, Enbridge Gas, if you're in New Brunswick, NB Power. In New Brunswick, there's also something called the Regional Development Corporation. And if you're in Nova Scotia, there's the Community Housing Transformation Center. All of these organizations offer some level of this pre-construction funding. And even if there's no funding program out there, ask your local government for some money anyway. Secure as much of this funding as you're able to. So if you're applying and, for example, FCM's planning grant has a maximum of $30,000, ask for the whole $30,000, right? Like, don't just say you need 15, because you'll end up needing more later, and then save your own money. So let's use that example. Let's say you're asking for 15 because you have $15,000 saved. Save your $15,000 for later in the project and spend their money first. Always spend somebody else's money first. That's a good, I think, rule of thumb in life, maybe. As well, once you're securing some of this funding, that's going to help demonstrate support for your project when you're applying for the full multi-million-dollar construction grants. So you can say like, oh, I've got backing from my local government, from the Regional Development Corporation, from this other group. It's going to make funders more likely to give you money. They kind of want to like add their name as opposed to being the first funder. So that's the pre-construction. What about the bigger one? What about the actual construction, the 3 million, 5 million, $20 million? What about that? Where are you getting that funding from? So step one is always applying for grants. You always want the free money first. This often comes from the government. So you can explore opportunities with CMHC, your province, and your local government. Your project manager is going to know which ones, and they've probably applied to them all before. If you're hiring somebody with some good experience, they will have for sure. You can also look at a document that Megan and I created. It's the national, well, we call it the National Funding and Financing Matrix. It's on our website. It specifically outlines CMHC's and FCM's programs. So if you're feeling lost looking at their funding, check out our matrix first, and it'll give you a quick snapshot, a little overview. Next, you want to explore some partnerships that might bring in some of their own funding or saved money. So if you're thinking about a daycare in your building, maybe they're actually bringing a bit of their own money that's going to help pay for this, or maybe they can apply for a grant that you're not eligible for, right? That's a really good partnership to have. Or if somebody else is renting some space in your building that are like-minded partners and share values, they might be able to bring some funding as well. You're definitely going to have to spend your own money, sadly. We call this equity, and this could be like cash reserves, it could be fundraising, surplus funds from previous years. If you own multiple pieces of land, this is kind of getting savvy, but you could leverage your assets and be able to bring some of that as equity too. And as a final option, you could consider financing or like a mortgage. The preference would be to go to CMHC over traditional banks or even credit unions. CMHC is just going to have a more favorable rate at the end of the day. But in order to borrow from them, you have to look at your operational budget. So we've been talking a lot about capital, but operational. So what is the revenue that's coming in? So the rents, which are probably really low, it's likely a provincial shelter rate. Are there any subsidies? What's the funding agreements that you have there? Do you have a social enterprise that brings in some money? So what's all the revenue coming in? And then look at that and balance it with your costs. So your staff salaries, paying for utilities, insurance on the building, all of those. And do you have more revenue than expenses? Whatever is left at the end, that's what you could afford to pay as a mortgage, right? So that would be your annual fee that you're going to pay back to CMHC. You can't, well, we don't think that you can include fundraising. And sometimes there's mixed messages on this, but for the most part, we're told no, you can't just have a line there of revenue being like, oh, we fundraise, I don't know, $50,000 every year. That's how we're going to pay for our mortgage. The bank's not going to take that because it has to be like guaranteed money source. You could think of it in a way that that fundraising pays for maybe a staff salary, like a program that you specifically run. And so maybe you just leave both of those off the operating budget. But at the end of the day, our message here is that you are going to need a mix of these sources to pay for your new building. And we call this a funding stack. So, and sadly, gone are the days of applying for kind of one government grant and having the one source that will cover your whole building. The need is so great these days and the funding is so competitive that you end up having to bring in a few other sources. Let's look at the government grant one a little bit closer though. So, you know, we've talked about CMHC and FCM. This would apply as well for provincial ones, but there's probably two different types of programs. One that's going to have a specific application window. So you're going to have a deadline with a date that you need to apply by. And it's probably going to be a bit of a rush trying to meet it, or you're trying to kind of align the stars with your design drawings to get into place so that you can actually apply for the funding. But the other type of programming is just like an open window. So these are programs that are currently open right now that you could apply to at any time. CMHC's Affordable Housing Fund, it used to be called the Co-Investment Fund, and the FCM money, that's all an open window, so you can apply at any time. We find in both cases that it can take months to hear if you're successful, sadly, and sometimes even longer to actually finalize the agreements. So be prepared to be patient after you've submitted your application. And then even then, once you have submitted your funding, they don't actually put all of the money into your account once you're successful. So for CMHC, we find that you actually, well, the CMHC process is that you have to have the, oh, sorry, I'm actually out of order with my notes. I'm gonna back up for a second. Okay, so you're successful with getting the funding. That's great. The problem is that the hard work doesn't end once you're successful. So you're actually going to receive a funding agreement from them. It's going to be kind of long and complex. It might be a bit overwhelming. That's why you have a project manager and probably your lawyer. So the two of you are going to review it, and yourself. You're all going to review it together and see if there's anything that stands out. And then from there, you're probably not going to be given the money right away in a lot of cases. So first up is that there's going to be conditions that you have to meet. And that could be, for example, obtaining planning approvals, completing a set of design drawings. Maybe you have to have tender design drawings, or you'll actually have to start a construction in some cases. So let's think about starting construction. If that's a condition for you to get your money, it means you're paying that hundreds of thousands of dollars still in design development to get to that stage. So even though you've secured your multi-million-dollar grant, which should relieve a lot of stress, and it does, you won't be able to spend it yet. And once they do start giving you the money, this is where I jump to, but once they do start giving you the money, they don't just give it to you all at once. So let's say you're successful with CMHC in getting a $3 million grant. They don't just put the $3 million in your account and then you use that to pay for the project. What happens with CMHC is that you get your invoice from your builder who's been doing work for that month. You pay a quantity surveyor to prepare a report. They submit the report to CMHC, and then CMHC releases the exact amount of money in the invoices. So maybe there's a whole bunch of invoices, maybe it's not just one, but they release that exact amount of money into your account, and then you pay the invoice. And the original invoice will have had, there's a Prompt Payment Act in place, so you have to pay it within 28 days. So that's a lot of work actually from a lot of people, a lot of coordinating, all within a tight time period. Megan and I are going to go over that in a bit more detail in our next webinar, and we'll actually show an example of what that kind of looks like in a calendar. Other funders, we find usually provinces and sometimes municipalities, they do it differently. They have what they call milestone payments. So for example, at 30% completion of your building, they'll give you 30% of the grant, 60%, 60%, like that kind of thing. But essentially either way that it's being done, whether it's through the invoices or milestone, for all of these reasons, you're going to want to make sure that you've got a bit of available equity. So like available cash to be able to spend on the project. You can't always rely on the grant being in your account. Okay, so now let's look at a bit of an example here. So this is a hypothetical project. Usually the numbers are not quite so nice and round, but we've got a project here that costs $10 million. And this is that funding stack that I talked about. So first up, they got the CMHC grant. They got $6 million. Let's say they applied to the Rapid Housing Initiative and got that as one grant. Really nice. They're also bringing $1 million of their own money. That was fundraising as well as surplus dollars. They applied to FCM. They got 170,000. Today you can get actually even more than that, which is great. City donated their land, so they donated it for free. They did what Megan talked about earlier. They hired their appraiser. They got the land valued at $500,000. So instead of telling the like the other funders, I got land for $0, you're actually demonstrating its value. The provincial grant they applied to in a window, it was also successful, $500,000, 200 donated from a local corporation, another 100 anonymous, all of that money. So these are a lot of sources, right? All three levels of government. There's still a gap. They had a gap of almost or a little more than $1.5 million. So they decided to borrow, and this is like their financing. They looked at their operational budget and they could afford it. So what are some tips? How did this hypothetical project have this kind of success? Definitely apply for that pre-construction funding early. So those FCM grants, get that in, maximize as much as you can get. Also save some of your own money. Even if it's like $50,000 at the beginning, just kind of save that, try not to use it, but start to accumulate as you go. We absolutely find it best to secure your land for free. If you're able to get the land donated from any level of government, from a philanthropist, a local corporation, whoever it is, and then have it appraised, so that you're not saying that it's zero. So get that value of the land. And then, when you're going to the next level of government, right, like leverage it. So let's say the city gave it to you in this example. Now use that in the provincial and the federal applications. You don't just say, oh, free land, zero. You say $500,000 land. That's what I'm bringing to this. You should join in too. You should also give me $500,000, right? The city did, you should too. So that's what you're trying to do there. Definitely be talking to corporations and foundations. You can do that early, but also once you've had a bit of success, it's kind of nice because then you're telling them like, oh, here's an opportunity for you to join as well. You're not just going and knocking on their door, kind of feeling like you're begging for money, that you're actually like, hey, this is a really cool project. I've got all these other people behind it. We're saving lives. Don't you want to be part of it? And then that's going to help kind of bolster this funding as well. You might want to do a capital fundraising campaign. We hear of a lot of shelters doing this. Some are doing it in-house. A few are hiring people as well, but build on the success that you're already having. So that's kind of getting your community on board. Maybe it's even when you're just trying to get across the finish line that you're just raising that last bit. And then the financing. So I kind of talked about the operating budget a couple times. So what you're going to do, if you feel comfortable with it, and if you feel like you've got this gap, one strategy that you could employ is that you look at your operating budget and try and slim it down to what you could do to get the doors open, to get women in the door. So maybe, you really want to have one of your programs that's super helpful and had a lot of success. Keep it off the budget for a moment, right? And then just keep it as like, how do you get your doors open? And then use that to lock in the financing so that you have it. So if you need it, you have it, that $1.5 million. Because now you're going to still finish your design development and you're going to do construction. That could be like another 18 months. Keep fundraising, keep doing your capital campaign during those 18 months. And maybe, even though we say $1.5 million here, maybe you have enough success that you raise another 500,000. Maybe a new grant comes out that you get to apply to, or a foundation opens something, apply to that, secure it, and then don't borrow 1.5, only borrow 1, because you only have to pay back the money that you borrowed, not the amount listed on the agreement. Okay, so that's a bit nuanced. It's a little bit of strategy. If you want to employ that, feel free to chat with Megan and I, and we can talk you through it after. Okay, so that's a lot of money talk, and we are nearing the end. I'm going to stop talking soon. Shifting gears. So similar to the feasibility study, you do want to be engaging the community during the design development phase. Keep talking to those stakeholders and local champions that you already identified. If you're in an urban area, you actually might have required consultation by your local government. Fulfill that. Understand and address any neighbors' concerns. There's a project I worked on where the neighbor's only concern was actually about tree canopy. They just want to make sure that it was green enough. No problem. Added some trees to the budget, able to afford it, made the neighbors really happy. They loved it. I mean, they're already behind the project, but that was their one concern. So listen to their concerns and see what you can address. And if you've hired a planning consultant, if you need one, definitely collaborate with them, but also your project manager and your architect can help you with some of this too. They might have some ideas. And then you have to make sure that your land is appropriately zoned for your project. So whether you're doing emergency, second stage, or even long-term housing, let's say that you were donated the land and it's zoned as industrial. You're going to need to have it as residential probably. So that will need to get changed before you're able to build. If you're getting that land donated, I would highly recommend that you have the city actually change the zoning for you. It's easier for them to do than you applying later. They might be able to do it for free as well. So ask them to do that before they donate it to you. If you're in an urban area, definitely recommend hiring the planning consultant. They can guide you through the whole planning approval process. Definitely arrange like a pre-consultation meeting with city staff too. And your consultant's gonna recognize and evaluate if there's any restrictions on your land. So we've used zoning as the example, but maybe the parking requirement, maybe you don't need as much parking as it says you do, or you wanna change your setbacks, how close you can build from your neighboring properties or the road. Maybe you wanna change that to get a couple more units out of the building. And finally, in some jurisdictions, site plan might also need to be submitted. If so, again, your consultant will help you with that. But essentially, a site plan is just outlining the layout and the design of the proposed development, and local elected officials have to approve it. Your architect or builder will secure the building permit before you can start construction. And you'll also need an occupancy permit before residents move in. Okay, that's the presentation. We're going to summarize it because that was a lot of information, and then we'll go to some questions. So make sure that your core team members share the same vision for your project and are really committed to the success. You want a dedicated team. You want people who are going to back you, be patient with your questions, and really support you through whatever hurdles are coming up. You're going to have to spend money in this phase. Sometimes it's going to be before you've had success with a grant yet. So we suggest preparing your board to actually take that risk, educating them on what the process is, and you can actually have them watch our webinar series. So, everything's being recorded, and maybe have them watch these 3 recordings in their spare time. You also want to engage staff very early in the designs, right? Like that was our starred thing to stand out. Their insights during this are going to be invaluable. So please try and include them in reviewing designs. And you're going to need to strike a balance between the ideal design and the costs, right? You probably can't, definitely dream big at the beginning, but understand that you might have to scale back a bit throughout. And really consider cost implications when you're being asked to make design decisions. A lot of steps that are happening in this phase are happening simultaneously. So your planning steps and community engagement are happening while you're securing funding, while you're progressing your designs, getting your costing, updating your financing, all of that kind of stuff. So it's a busy phase. And then finally, have some reserve funds available to continue with the project. So even though you secured some funding, pre-construction funding will get spent quickly, and you might not actually get your construction dollars before you're having to spend more of them. So yeah, if you can set aside some reserves, that's going to be a huge help and a lot of stress off your plate. Okay, we'll pause now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kyla. So there's been so much great information shared. Just a reminder to folks, you can pop your questions into the Q&A box. To get us going here, so we have a question around CMHC funding in particular, and the person says, getting funding from the CMHC has been a challenge. It feels like the goalposts keep moving. We've been asked to resubmit new estimates, documents, and details we didn't have for less money than we asked for that we now need to report on for 20 years. Can you give us some tips on how to make working with CMHC smoother?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to this feeling. It's unfortunate because obviously they're a really major funder for these types of programs. Honestly, any affordable housing, CMHC really is the one to go to. Do I have tips? It feels a bit context dependent. I think having a good relationship with, you've probably got one person who's like your geographic, I don't know, representative. Building that relationship is important. I think asking them to explain even really simple questions can be good. If you're finding that relationship is not working, you can ask to talk to somebody above them if you're finding that maybe the relationship can be confrontational, or if you're finding that actually the responses you're getting back are contradicting things that they've said earlier. You can go higher than them. It's probably awkward to try and ask that. We have emails of people higher than them. So I'd say feel free to reach out to Megan and I, and we can help guide you there. Also, we could have just a one-on-one chat with you and to understand kind of where you're at and which program you're going through. I think if you're applying multiple times, it might be what was the co-investment fund, now the affordable housing fund, and they have revamped that. Part of it is that they've run out of money, so they kind of adjusted their program from what it was. Definitely when I was working with it about 4 years ago, it's changed a lot in that time period. I think it was last summer, they were basically out of money. They added a bit more in the fall, and the budget recently, they've added a bit more there too. So I would hope that they could increase the amount of money maybe that you're getting from them. Yeah, overall tips, I'd say just trying to build the relationship, trying to ask them to do things really simply. And I know this would be putting more work on your side, but really documenting what you're getting from them. Let's say they're having a verbal conversation with you. You can always follow up in an email after and be like, hey, this is what I heard you say. Just do a whole bunch of bullets and actually ask them to be like, can you confirm? And then you've got it written somewhere. So if you are finding that, in the question they're saying it's gone back and forth and changed a few times, then you can go back and be like, hey, 3 months ago you said this. Why has that changed? I know that that's putting a bit more work on your plate. You could ask them to do it. I don't know if that would work, but you could ask them if it's after a verbal conversation, to kind of put it on them to put it into some writing and follow up with notes. Um, those are some tips. But if you want to get into the nitty gritty of your project, happy to do a one-on-one after this.
Awesome. Thanks, Kyla. And just flagging that question was submitted anonymously, so I can't connect the person to you. So for the person who asked, Kyla's email is in the chat and will be at the end of this. So yes, please feel free to reach out to Kyla directly. So I don't have any more questions in the box at the moment. So why don't we move on to Amanda, who's going to share some of her experience from actually going through some of these processes, and then we will have more question time at the end. So do take this opportunity as well to put those questions into the box. So over to you, Amanda.
So my name is Amanda Owens. I am the Executive Director at Ksan Society. We're located on the traditional unceded Tsimshian territory of the Kitsilis and Kitsim-Kalim people. These lands are located in northwestern BC, otherwise known as Terrace. I've been with Ksan since 2007 and the Executive Director since 2014. We're an umbrella organization operating anti-violence programs, multiple social housing programs, and food security programs. We are a few weeks away from completion of our 22-unit second stage housing project, and prior to that, we completed both a 45-unit affordable housing project and a 52-unit supportive housing project in 2019. We are also currently in the design phase of a 39-unit mixed income project. As Megan was speaking about earlier, it's really important when hiring team members to know and understand the procurement process and guidelines in your province, or what's set out by your funder. So determining the evaluation criteria is important to establish a team that aligns with your organization. Ensure you discuss this with your project manager and or your architect, as it impacts the outcome of your selection, as we've had a few experiences where members didn't quite fit with our team and it can cause issues or conflicts along the way. It's important to pay attention to the details in the design phase and make sure you ask for everything you want, the dream big idea. Think about the function of each space and how you will utilize it operationally and what external partners may want or need when coming into your space. Agencies such as RCMP, the local health authority, or MCFD. Do they require a separate private space, or is there a communal flex space that can be utilized? You may want to engage with them early in the process to find out what they might need. Also, how many staff do you have in the building versus offices? Funders often want to cut back as much as possible on common areas and offices, but it's possible if you provide sufficient rationale that they may allow it. When it comes to choosing materials for your building, think about the wear and tear as well as ongoing maintenance. For example, we avoid the crank windows as cranks get lost and the hinges get broken easily and they're costly to replace. In our second stage project, we requested a different kind of window. So our architect found one that is limited how much it opens, but it opens in two different directions. These windows were quite fancy and much more expensive, but because they are highly efficient, they were acceptable for the project. I also know of another organization here in BC that was able to get granite countertops in their project, as they're much more durable and saves money operationally. So it all comes down to rationale. The locations of the rooms in relation to the rest of the building may also be important. Where the elevator is located in your building, whether it's centrally located on one end of your building or the other, will impact the accessibility of each of your units or the rooms in your shelter. Where are your common room spaces, and do you need kitchenettes and washrooms in them? How many janitorial rooms do you have, and where are they located? In one of our buildings that wasn't designed by us, it was owned by our funder, they forgot janitorial rooms with mop sinks on a 3-floor building with no elevator. So it's important to pay attention to those little details. Do you want in-suite laundry or common laundry? And is it going to be coin laundry or free laundry? Lots of different questions to answer along the way. The mechanical system is really important to us. We live in the north, and traditionally our funder wouldn't install air conditioning in any of our buildings, but now with the extreme heat, we're having a lot of issues, and adding that in later on is much more expensive. Landscaping is also important when thinking about maintaining the property long term. How much weeding will be required, what types of trees are being suggested, how many leaves will fall, and what raking is required. Do you need privacy on certain sides of the building, and therefore shrubs would be better suited? And also walk through your building frequently throughout the development process. Walking through the building will give you a better idea of how it will function operationally, and you'll be able to identify items that may need to be changed that doesn't necessarily impact the design or cost significantly. It's important to provide your input prior to project completion, because once the building is handed over for operation, any post-construction changes are the cost of the operator. So those are the types of considerations we focus on when going through the design phase.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Amanda. So helpful to have that on the ground experience from your projects. So I am going to pass it to Kyla just for a couple of quick wrap-up slides, and then we are going to open it up for Q&A. So put those questions in the box while Kyla wraps it up here.
Perfect. Yeah, so we've been mentioning that this is a 3-part webinar series quite a few times. So the third webinar is taking place 2 weeks from now in the exact same time slot, so 1 till 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. Just noting it'll be different across the country. And we're going to go over construction and operations as the final 2 phases together in that one series. And they'll be all the same speakers again, so you'll see us one more time. And then, as mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, as well as throughout, we've been talking about the resources that we've been creating, and I know that Leah popped a link to it into the chat, but highly recommend you checking out our website. And if there's anything that you feel you need that doesn't exist, that you think yourself and or other shelters would want to, please let us know. We're always looking for more that we can create and add to our add to the list there. And then we also have a mailing list. So hopefully everybody here has already signed up, but if you're interested in anything to do with development, wanting to hear about, new funding opportunities that are coming out, or the new resource that Megan and I have created, we'll send that out via the mailing list. So yeah, you can always sign up there too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So to get the questions started here, the first question is there a work back schedule template that exists that we could use as a starting point?
Question, not that we have created at this point. So there might be some out there online. I would say they probably don't quite cover everything. I would recommend, like, if you're in, let's say, that feasibility phase, that you're hiring somebody, that you do like a work plan that just outlines all of like that scope of work. Essentially, you could look at like the slides that we have that had the like, what are all the actions taking place? It's kind of that middle box in that slide, and that would outline sort of what actions are needed to be taken. But it would also depend on, like, I guess if you're asking like for yourself as like the owner and operator, like what are your tasks? Because the architect is going to have a whole bunch, the builder is going to have a whole bunch, all those different team members will have quite a few. But that could be something that, yeah, we look into creating as well.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't have any more questions queued up here, so we do still have a few minutes, folks, if you want to put them in. While folks are doing that, I wonder, could you, because you covered this in the first webinar and you've mentioned it a few times, but I'm not sure you've given the whole overview. So what are the one-on-one sessions that you and Megan offer?
Yeah, so Megan and I are happy to meet with you anytime you'd like. It would be virtual. I think we've gotten really good at that in the last few years. Megan and I are based in Ottawa, so if you happen to be in Ottawa, we could always arrange something in person. But yeah, just reach out, send us an email. It's helpful to know exactly where you're at in your project. If you could just give us like a couple quick sentences, say like, oh, just at the outset, trying to figure things out. We're meeting with a shelter next week that messaged us, just interested to know more about funding opportunities. It sounds like they're quite progressed with their project. They've got a lot of designs. They've got really detailed cost estimates. They're just sort of waiting for that final larger construction multi-million-dollar grant. So we're going to chat about that and kind of come up with, usually we try and do kind of thinking about what the next steps are. So what are some strategies that they could involve? What are things that Megan and I have seen on other projects that have been successful? It's kind of thinking about like who else should be involved? Yeah, what are your next steps? And then we're always happy to follow up. So sometimes we hear from these shelters 3 or 6 months later, or even a year later, actually, in one shelter's case, and then we can just offer additional support at that time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we don't have any other questions. I'm going to pop a little feedback survey into the chat. So if folks have any feedback on the webinar, you can open that up and let us know. Before we close, because we do have a few minutes, maybe I'll ask you, is there anything you didn't have time to fit into today's webinar that you wanted to add? This is a chance, and if not, then we can wrap it up and we'll share the resources and recording shortly.
I mean, like Megan said, I think each of these presentations could be so much. I feel like I even went over my time anyway, trying to speak really slowly. But I personally don't have anything to add. Maybe I'll let Megan or Amanda.
I also don't have anything to add. We hope that this was helpful, though. We're really looking forward to receiving your feedback, so that we can tailor these webinars to what you're looking for and what your needs are. So thank you so much for coming.
I feel like it's a very overwhelming process, especially for someone new trying to get a project off the ground. But for us, it was really, really key hiring a development consultant. And I think Kyla and Megan refer to them as project managers, as they do take a huge load off of the executive director's plate in trying to push your project forward.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. So I will just say again, a big thank you to Kyla, Megan, Amanda for this insight. Oh, sorry. There's always a question as soon as I start wrapping up. Okay, so how does a person find a development consultant?
Yes, and maybe I'll answer, and then Amanda, if you want to talk about how you found yours too, that would be good. But I mean, a quick Google search, but like we actually have like a pretty growing decent list at this point. So depending on where you are, it's always nice to have somebody local. They're going to understand a bit more about the like local government grants or even your provincial ones. That's not to say that somebody who works on a more national organization wouldn't be good. There's a lot of nonprofit development consultants as well. They will probably understand the nuances of your building better than if you were working with, I don't know, like a Hanscom or Ellis Don or, you know, those like really big companies. You're probably going to get a different level of service from somebody who's smaller who understands that scope. And also, if there's people that like are in your sector that you know have done a recent building in the last little while, ask them who they hired, ask them if the relationship was good, and understand that way, just to get a bit of experience from somebody who's local. And when you are trying to find them, it's nice to always get a couple of quotes, right? So if you're just like hear about the first one and grab them, like maybe if you can get 2 or 3, ask for like a fee proposal from them. You can ask for references. You can ask for their experience, kind of those steps that Megan was outlining. For a development consultant, you could also scope their work smaller to start. You could just have them do your feasibility assessment. It's a smaller scope. You're not going to pay them as much. And you can also see if the relationship works well. See if you do like working with them. And then, you know, they're going to be applying for your grants. They can get you your big construction one, and then you can keep working together as a great relationship. I also see sometimes where some organizations, they use, like, this might be for more affordable housing, or maybe for Amanda, I don't know if you worked with the same one for multiple buildings, but if the relationship's good, that's what you're going to do. You're going to keep going back to the same person. They're going to do all your buildings. And they're even going to be like, hey, remember how you didn't like the windows for that other building? Where we like have that knowledge, and it actually saves you from having a lot of conversations as you go, because you can reference back the exact same things together, which is nice.
Yeah, so for us, we approached our funder and they provided us with a list of development consultants. You could also go to your association, your provincial association, who might have a list of development consultants. And yes, Kyla, we have had the same development consultant on multiple projects, and it has been super helpful because we've developed a really strong relationship, and they know us as an organization and what's important to us and what we like and what we don't like. So it's been very helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Um, yeah, so I'll try this again. Thank you to Megan, Kyla, and Amanda for this great insight. And thank you as well to the folks in the background. So, our wonderful interpreters, our tech support, and everyone who's participated today. It wouldn't make sense to do this without your participation. So, thank you to everyone. I am going to send around in a few days, maybe early next week, the recording of this webinar, the PowerPoint presentations, any of the resources or links that we mentioned. So you will get all of that by email. And I encourage you to come out to the third and last webinar in 2 weeks because it's going to cover a lot more wonderful information about construction and is not to miss. So have a great day, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Bye.